Well, as we get into this fifth chapter on experimental research, kind of an introduction to it as we move into the more complex parts of experimental research, I've been sitting here for the last while scratching my head as to how I do a brief video about this particular chapter. Not that it needs to be long. I just think that this chapter does a really good job of kind of walking you through some of the main things that you need to consider over the next few chapters. That and the questions that I've chosen, along with the format that I've asked you to complete some of those more involved applied questions. I think those are really going to carry you through this week. So, excuse me, as I get into addressing a few things, I want to let you know that it's not going to be comprehensive because I think this chapter does a pretty good job. And I know that I'm going to see you in our class meeting on Wednesday. And so I'm just not too concerned that if you're working hard on this chapter that you'll get it. So maybe I can use this video to tell you sort of like what's important, what's more important, what's less important, what we're going to see coming up. Maybe provide more structure and some expectations for what's upcoming, and maybe that'll be the best way for this. So, online course research methods. I've never done it before, and so every chapter is a bit different. Okay, so yeah, let's start with let's just go to the questions. Let's do that. That's probably going to be the best thing. So, as an introduction to experimental research, what you need to know is that there's many different ways to do experimental research, and but chapter by chapter over the next few weeks, it's going to get more complicated. But this week, the authors have, and I think this is the way we tend to think about experiments. I'll just say it this way. Okay. I have let's say I have a new vaccine treatment. It's timely, isn't it? Let's say I have a new vaccine treatment. I want to do a clinical trial to see if this vaccine treatment is going to work. And so I take a sample from a population and I put them into two groups, and I do that through a process called random assignment. And I put those, and one group gets the drug treatment and the other group doesn't. And then you couldn't do this. This is the I don't think you could do this unless you're really desperate. But then you infect people with a virus, and then you see how do the groups respond. So how many die? How many are on ventilators? How many have no symptoms? How many don't get it at all? And you compare those two groups. And then if there's a difference between your two groups, you use an inferential statistic, and you start to make some conclusions that are more general to the population with some amount of statistical confidence. So that is a typical experiment. Now, when we are doing an experiment like that, we are performing a manipulation. Remember, I told you that you should be thinking about yourself as a researcher in this course. So put yourself into the researcher's position. What are you doing? You're setting up this whole thing in order to find an answer at the end. And what you need to do, think about it like a board game. I've been playing a lot more games with my family during this pandemic. And if the board game, like we have this one game called, let's say card game, Exploding Kittens. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's not as bad as it sounds. But in that card game, if you're supposed to take out some cards and then shuffle the cards and then deal the cards and then put these cards back in. And if you forget to do that, the whole game, you get to the end and you say, well, where were these cards that we needed to figure out who won or who lost? Oh my goodness, we forgot to shuffle them back in. The whole thing is for nothing. And that's really what this chapter is about, is once you set up a good experiment, um, it will produce, you will get the end that you are looking for. But if you don't take all of these questions that are presented in this chapter into consideration, with like confounds and control, and we're going to learn more about all that stuff. But if you don't put those things into place, you will not have a meaningful outcome. Like any good researcher will come by and look at your study and say, you've got 4 problems here. You can't trust your results. Okay. And that is everything from a good operational definition to how you randomly assigned or how you got your participants to your manipulation, which is where I started a minute ago. Okay. The manipulation means that you decide that one group gets one thing and another group gets another thing. Now, in a simple experiment, there's one manipulation and everything else is held constant. This is the reason why we can get that second part of or the third, I guess, the third aspect of the scientific process, which is explain. This is how we can explain how one thing affects change in another thing, is by doing an experiment on them, right? So this is not correlation where we're just looking at the relationship, but we're testing a direction. What is this thing's effect manipulating this thing, this variable? What is the effect on this other variable? And then we just happen to call them the independent variable and its effect on the dependent variable. I don't find independent and dependent very helpful. When I was first learning this, I couldn't keep them straight. I guess you come up with like, well, the dependent variable depends on what happens with the independent variable. I guess that's a kind of way to think through it. But I think just with practice, you're going to get this. Okay. Um, yeah. And the independent variable, I don't know how you remember that, except that you just start with that. Okay. So you manipulate that, and you can manipulate it into 2 different, we're just talking about one independent variable right now. Later, we'll add multiple independent variables. But right now, we're just saying one independent variable. You can split it into 2 groups, like they get it and they don't get it. Or it could be, let's say effects of caffeine on studying efficiency or something. If we wanted to do that, we could do caffeine in different doses, right? We could do it in 4 different what we call conditions. Okay, so you need to know that levels of an independent variable. You should also know that levels of an independent variable. So the independent variable is caffeine, and the levels are 0 milligrams, 2 milligrams, 4 milligrams, 6 milligrams. Okay. And those become conditions. Those are conditions. They're manipulated conditions. So that's how we think through manipulated variables. Now, there is a part of I'm not going to be able to find it right away, am I? Let's see. There's a part here where they talk about different kinds of variables, like task variables and situational variables. You don't need to know anything about that. Variables are variables, okay? What you do need to know is that subject variables are when you don't introduce a manipulation, but when the people themselves are the manipulation. So if you had a group of people and it's men and women, and you want to look at the differences between men and women, that would be a subject variable. If you wanted to look at 4-year-olds versus 5-year-olds, subject variable. Workers at Microsoft versus workers at Apple, subject variable. So this is, in some ways, you could think about it as a nominal scale, right? These are categories of people that we are, and fundamental to our hypothesis is what is the difference between men and women on a measure of happiness? Okay, that's a subject variable, and you don't need to do any other kind of manipulation. But it does have problems because it's actually not a true experiment. It's actually, every time you do a subject variable experiment, it's actually quasi-experimental. Why? Because you're not doing a manipulation. It's got inherent problems in it, actually, for generalizability. And so the true experiment is the best experiment, but you can't, for example, you can't manipulate sex, right? So you can't take a group of people from the population into your sample and say, well, you are going to be men, you're going to be men, and you're going to be women. It just doesn't work that way. So sometimes we have to do that. And then later in the course, I'll show you how we can get some pretty good understanding of differences even with a subject variable, um, and more meaningful kind of understandings of outcomes. Okay, confounds are any outside variable that is not controlled for. Okay. Um, well, in fact, let me see what your textbook says here, because I think I'm going to help you out with extraneous versus confound variables. Okay. Extraneous variables. Extraneous variables are all of the variables in the world that could potentially impact the study that you're doing. Sometimes they're really obvious and sometimes not. Okay. Those extraneous variables need to be controlled. Well, thank goodness for something called random assignment, which I've mentioned probably 3 times in this video so far. So you must know random assignment. You must understand this, that with random assignment, extraneous variables are largely controlled for. Now, extraneous variables that are not controlled for, so they could influence your outcome. So let's say you were studying, let's see, a classroom study technique, and you have 2 classes. This actually happens in classroom research a lot, right? Where you have but let's say it's more laboratory. Let's do this, where you have 60 students and you're going to separate them into 2 groups. One group is going to try a new study technique. The other group is going to try a typical traditional technique. Okay. So you randomly assign them into their groups. Great. You did a good job with that. And now you're going to train them in each of the techniques, and then you're going to give them an exam to see. So pretty good study, right? But here's where you actually made a mistake. You're going to make a mistake. And the mistake is you only have one classroom to do it in. So you do one condition, you test them at, or you train them at 10 a.m. And the other condition, you train them at 12 p.m. You have now introduced an extraneous variable that is a confound. Okay, so you have an extraneous variable. Now those always exist, but random assignment takes care of many of them. But in this case, this extraneous variable is a confound. It means it's going to have an effect, or it potentially could have an effect on your outcome. So and if you haven't kind of picked up why that variable is a confound, it's because well, let me ask you, pause it for a second and identify what is the variable, the confound variable. If you said time of day, you are correct. Okay. So measuring people at 10 a.m. versus 12 p.m., and it doesn't matter that 12 p.m. is lunch, it could be any time, 2 p.m. versus 3 p.m. Because you are introducing a difference between the groups, you don't know whether your exam score in the end has to do with your training or whether it has to do with the time of day. And so your experiment's really busted. It's kind of worthless because you don't know why you got the results you got. So you need to have a carefully controlled study. In that case, you'd want to make sure that you get your groups going at the same time. Now, you could do it in 2 different classrooms, but now you've introduced a confound of doing it in 2 different rooms. What if one room is colder than the other room? There's just all kinds of things that are problems. So you want to make sure that your groups have the exact same experience other than the manipulation. Okay. Um, let's see. I'm just looking through your questions here. Um, we talk about different types of validity again in this chapter, and internal validity. I promised you it was coming. It is here. It is probably the most important term that we will talk about in the next 4 or so weeks. I can't remember what I'm doing for a final in this class. I just can't remember right now, but guaranteed that there will be some mention of internal validity on it. It's one of the big takeaways in this course. And so you learn a couple things about validity as they apply to experiments now, in studies in general, but experiments specifically. Last chapter we looked at validity as it pertains to instrument or construct measurement, and now we're talking about, like, what about a full study? What are the areas of validity? So The most external validity means it's that value of applying psychological research in real world. So if something is only valuable in a laboratory, that's not very helpful. So external validity is, how does this work outside of here? How does this work with other people? How does this work, or what? How true is this in other environments? Those kinds of things. But the most important one is internal validity, and that means if you say our study has internal validity, it means that we properly controlled for everything. All those confounds, potential confounds, all the extraneous variables were controlled for. Um, our findings are sound. There was nothing that we missed, and so you can look at a study, um, and this is really setting up the last part of this chapter, which is threats to internal validity. You should be able to look at a study and see where the threats are. What would potentially weaken the study? This is where I love research methods. As a researcher, you're kind of a detective. What are the possible threats to this coming out well? Threats to internal validity. If you can right now pause this video and just talk out loud, what is your understanding of internal validity? How would you explain it to somebody? If you can do it, great. If you can't, you're not quite there. So keep working on it. Okay. Um, let's see. Yeah. So when we get into these other questions, these questions ask particular things, but really over the years, what I've realized is all these questions are opportunities to go through all the parts of an experiment all the time. So you are going to get used to the format that I've presented for you. For example, for 5.1, it asks for the independent variables, the levels of the independent variables, and the dependent variables. Those three parts, and then whether they're manipulated or non-manipulated. And by the way, non-manipulated means subject in this case. So are they manipulated variables or not? Part of this question is omitted, asking you particular whether it's a situational variable or a task variable. Don't worry about that. And then include the scale of measurement being used. So anyway, I've used that and asked you for even a few other things that kind of include things from the past, like what would be the next question in this study that you would ask if you did do this study. Anyway, if you have questions about that, please post them on Ask Questions here. I can help you out, or somebody else can. So, okay. So, really, that's what these are all about. When you're going through your chapter, I do want to remind you on those research examples that are given periodically. I think there's a few in chapter 5. You should have a piece of paper beside you, and as you're reading through them, pull out the independent variable, the dependent variable, the operational definitions, etc. for all of that. So that will be helpful. Okay. You're being asked about confounds. So what I talked about earlier, going in and or looking at a study and thinking about what's wrong with this. What other things are in play here other than our independent variable that could affect the outcome? So another way to put this is, and if you didn't catch it from the reading, is that internal validity means that you have control. And control here is not like controlling, you're like controlling something. No, it means that I guess it does mean somewhat being in control of what is affecting your dependent variable. You are in control. You have control. You have controlled all of the extraneous variables. Does that make sense? So that now there are only two things in play: the independent variable and the dependent variable. So when you are in these scenarios like 5.2.2 with the patients with schizophrenia, part of the challenge here is you are pulling out, by the way, multiple variables in these situations. In some of these situations anyway, you want to students have trouble identifying what the variable is. In my example, where we had students come in at 10 a.m. and then 12 p.m. The variable there was, again, what was it? Time, right? Time of day. That was the variable. So, and then I introduced another variable later. It was like one room is hot, one room is cold. That in that case, that would be the variable would be temperature, right? So make sure you pull out all the extraneous variables that you see there. You will be responsible for that. So don't just pull out one and be done. We're looking for all of them. So, okay, I think this is fairly straightforward otherwise. I hope that was helpful as we look into the beginnings of understanding experimental research, and then particularly things like manipulation and internal validity, confounds. These are really important concepts here. So anyway, I will see you all on Wednesday, and I hope you have a wonderful week.